The first time they captured a human alive, they underestimated what they had taken. In the bowels of the verdant crucible, a biologic fortress orbiting the gas giant Enthys IX, the Thalkesh, a species evolved to dominate through psionic precision and surgical cruelty, had gathered their prime xenopsychologists to dissect the mystery of Earthborn resistance. Humanity had emerged on the edges of known space, violent, disorganized, reckless. Yet against all expectations, their colonies survived assaults meant to extinguish them. Their fleets returned fire in mathematically improbable ways, and worst of all, their soldiers refused to break. So when the 73rd Subjugation Swarm raided Titan's outpost and dragged back a single survivor, the Thalkesh rejoiced. The being was male, early 20s by Terran age reckoning, bearing the lean, undernourished physiology of someone running far beyond normal limits. His skin was torn at the knuckles, one eye purpled with swelling, and despite the disfigured face, he smiled when they threw him into the restraint cradle. The scientists noted the anomaly. No sobbing, no bargaining, just a broken laugh in the words, "Nice setup, you got a Red Bull." The lead inquisitor, Kethvarn, whose title loosely translated to Reconstructor of Broken Wills, motioned for sedation. "Keep him lucid. Begin degradation protocol immediately." For the Thalkesh, victory was not a question of force, it was of endurance. They didn't burn worlds, they erased them slowly, ensured populations surrendered long before annihilation was necessary. One of their core techniques was a refined form of forced wakefulness, a psychochemical suppression of REM cycles. Most species deteriorated within 2 to 3 planetary rotations. Hallucinations began in 6 hours, suicidal ideation by 30. On human subject 73, designation Mason Carter, nothing went according to design. The deprivation units were black monoliths of soundless agony. Inside, gravity would shift, lights would pulse in randomized rhythms, the air pumped with just enough carbon variance to rattle the nerves. But Mason remained upright, his pupils dilated normally. His mind registered all the spikes and dips in pressure, but no pleading crossed his voice. After 30 hours, he began speaking to the cameras. "You know, this reminds me of finals week. One time I was doing a coding project, trying to finish 2 essays and build a microfusion model for my exomech class while running on caffeine, Oreos, and spite." The sensors in the room hesitated, transmitting confusion back to the observers. Mason rubbed his eyes, chuckled, and muttered to himself, "This ain't even hard mode yet." Kethvarn stared at the feed. "Activate cranial phase disruptions, cycle 4, and rotate gravity inversion, 10-second intervals. Let's see if the humor survives now." By day 3, the team expected collapse. The human was supposed to be catatonic, or at least writhing in psychotic disarray. But instead, Mason was pacing in the chamber, humming off-tune rock songs and naming each flicker of light like old dorm roommates. "Blinker over there's a dick," he said. "Keeps me up at night, reminds me of Johnson." One of the junior xenopsychologists flared his crest in alarm. "He is anthropomorphizing the torture environment, turning stimuli into coping mechanisms. The stress conversion matrix is failing." "Adjust hormonal inhibitors," snapped Kethvarn. "Scramble his language centers, will break his internal monologue." By the 5th day, Mason had been stripped of all linguistic context, his brain unable to distinguish between syntax and noise. Theoretically, he should have descended into silence, severed from cognitive anchoring. Instead, he began drawing. He used the blood from his split knuckles, trailing patterns on the padded wall, not random swirls, designs, geometries, fractal spirals and orbital equations, things the Thalkesh recognized from deep sensor scans around Sol system prototypes, ideas their own scientists had only half theorized. "How is he doing this?" whispered one of the analysts. "He's not doing it," Kethvarn hissed. "He was already trained, he was already conditioned. This isn't a failure of technique, this is a misunderstanding of the species." And then came the turning point, day 7. Mason collapsed, the observers leaned forward. Finally, the limits of the human nervous system had been reached. But then, without any warning, Mason pushed himself up, swaying, his bloodshot eyes wild and glassy, and he screamed. "This is just college." It wasn't a phrase they could translate easily. The word college held no precise equivalence in Thalkesh society, but the way he roared it, the way his limbs surged, feral and radiant with something beyond endurance, made it clear. This wasn't surrender, this was war cry. He stood upright, unassisted. Kethvarn nearly ruptured a neural cluster in frustration. "Send in the drones, physically restrain him, resedate and isolate, I want cortical peelback." But before the drones reached the chamber, Mason did something else. He looked directly at the surveillance lens, smiled again, and in a hoarse whisper said, "You're gonna need more than this." What the Thalkesh hadn't realized yet, what they couldn't comprehend, was that humanity had built its civilization on fatigue, on pushing through exhaustion. Their greatest inventions were forged not in comfort but in deadline panic. Their heroes didn't train for the perfect moment, they improvised when the world collapsed. They hadn't captured a specimen. They had captured a storm. And the storm had just begun to rise. The Thalkesh made a second mistake. They isolated Mason Carter instead of executing him. Under any other circumstance, it would have been the correct decision: deeper analysis, more tests, a full cerebral dissection of what they believed was an outlier among a flawed species, but they didn't understand what they were watching. The disjointed movements Mason made in the cell, stretching, breathing through grit teeth, humming cracked melodies, were not signs of collapse. They were rituals, earthborn survival mechanisms, honed over generations of pressure and sleepless invention. And while his body frayed, his mind sharpened. Sleep had not come, but neither had surrender. Mason wasn't trying to endure anymore, he was adapting. By day 9, he began syncing his pulse to the low-frequency hum of the station's power grid. It gave him rhythm, purpose, a tempo to think by. When the Thalkesh introduced new psychic disruptors into the air, he began breathing slower, controlled. He tracked the color shifts in the lighting panels, predicting energy cycles. He memorized drone patrol timings by counting the seconds between the soft hydraulic hiss of the wall seams. In the absence of rest, Mason found clarity. And the Thalkesh saw none of it. They were preparing a neural excision when the outer decks of the verdant crucible shook. Just a tremor, the analyst said, an aftereffect from the station's tidal orbit, but it wasn't tidal pressure, it was movement. Human ships, small and undetected, had reached Enthys IX's magnetic shadow. A stealth fleet, jerry-rigged from asteroid haulers and repurposed mining vessels, had arrived. And none of it made sense. Humanity wasn't supposed to know the crucible existed, let alone navigate its gravitational perimeter. Its position was classified beyond local spacetime drift, but they were there, firing concentrated plasma bursts on micro-intervals using an oscillating cadence that disrupted Thalkesh targeting AI. The Thalkesh scrambled to respond, but their defenses hesitated. It was as if the attackers already knew the patterns, every pulse, every shield fluctuation, as though someone had been feeding them internal data. Because someone had. Mason Carter had used the walls, the spiral designs, the orbital calculations, all encoded into fractal equations, unnoticed by the guards but perfectly legible to an artificial cognition system trained to detect Terran information structures. His drawings had been transmitted through microscopic surface charges in the insulation layers, a passive transmission relayed through biometric fluctuations that matched Mason's heartbeat. Not screams, not cries for help. Instructions. The storm had sent out coordinates, and now it had called its lightning. In the command deck, Kethvarn stared at the chaos. Human ships were diving through point of fence like insects on fire. One of the Crucible's 12 spine towers had already been severed. The dreadnoughts positioned in orbit failed to respond in time. Static corrupted their relays, hacked by crude but effective code injection signals based on the ancient Terran operating systems deemed too primitive for concern. Kethvarn didn't see tactics, he saw anomaly, the impossible, and he recognized the source. Find Subject 73, terminate immediately. But Mason wasn't in the cell anymore. He'd escaped during the first breach, crawled through ductwork laced with electric pulse deterrents. His skin was scorched, fingertips blackened, but he moved like someone who'd long stopped recognizing pain as a barrier. The human will wasn't built to resist torture. It was built to operate through it. As the station quaked under bombardment, Mason reached the lower engineering hold. He'd memorized it from the schematics glimpsed during feigned stupor. The systems were complex, yes, but not impenetrable. Nothing built could ever be truly secure from a human who refused to sleep. He hacked into the gravitational stabilizer relay with nothing but a multi-tool scavenged from a medical bot and a length of synaptic fiber he'd torn from his own neural cuff. Once inside the system, he whispered, "Let's see what your idea of an all-nighter really looks like." And he flipped the spin matrix. The verdant crucible tilted 3 degrees off-axis. It shouldn't have mattered. But to a station this size, with its own internal tidal pressures and sun-tracking orbital gyros, it meant havoc. Hallways became traps, drone coordination shattered, firing solutions corrupted. And still the ships advanced. Ugly, patched-together Terran ships. Machines that weren't supposed to fly, weren't supposed to fight, and yet punched through layers of Thalkesh armor like blunt instruments of myth. Mason, barely upright, activated the comms he'd rebuilt from disassembled torture monitors. "Command, this is Carter, found the toy box. Might have broken a few pieces. Tell Anderson he owes me a week's sleep." The voice that answered was dry, steady, and amused. "You're out of your mind, Mason." "Copy that," he coughed, grinning through blood. "College rules." On Earth, they'd written legends about ancient warriors who fought until their final breath. On Enthys IX, the humans rewrote it, not with honor, not with elegance, but with caffeine, adrenaline, and the stubborn refusal to die tired. In the command deck, Kethvarn realized something he had never admitted before. This species was not weak. It was unpredictable. Their pain didn't dull their will, their fatigue didn't slow them, it made them creative. No single mind could account for the sheer erratic brilliance of a human stripped of sleep, fear, and protocol. Mason Carter wasn't an anomaly. He was a preview. And Earth was sending more. The fall of the verdant crucible rippled across the stars like a shiver through a frozen sea. In less than 4 standard hours, one of the Thalkesh Empire's most secure interrogation and analysis outposts had been reduced to drifting debris, its archives vaporized, its AI cores burned out by electromagnetic surges traced to unrefined Terran code compiled under duress within a prison cell. The surviving Thalkesh staff who escaped described the incident not as an attack but as an eruption, something irrational, chaotic, beautiful in its horror. The High Synod convened within the mind-vaulted halls of Omthvara, the deep-orbit enclave where centuries of military doctrine had been codified in psionic lattice. There, the archivists played back fragments of surveillance. Subject 73, Mason Carter. They watched him drag his broken body across the Crucible's main power relay and detonate its gravity core with a scavenged drive detonator. They watched him laugh as the station shuddered apart, speaking to no one, whispering into the void, "God, I miss ramen." The silence that followed within the synod was absolute, not even the thought chatter moved. Then came the order, a new classification. Homo sapiens sapiens, unstable, high-risk species, quarantine protocol suggested, escalation level beta prime. But the galaxy didn't run on Thalkesh fears alone. It ran on alliances, on cold calculations of risk and value, and Earth, once dismissed as a resource-poor anomaly, now occupied the center of every strategic map. A delegation was dispatched from the Velar Ascendancy to observe the Terran situation. The Velari were thinkers, old beyond reckoning. They communicated in light sculpture and memory weaving and had watched empires rise and burn like candles. They came not to conquer but to understand. Their ship, the Silent Vector, entered Sol's space broadcasting a non-hostile symphony of quantum glyphs. But even they, with all their ancient grace, did not expect what they found. Earth was awake. The Crucible's destruction had lit a fire under Terran leadership. Mason Carter's return, half-carried, half-dragged onto a medship by a squad of sleep-deprived engineers still running combat calculations in their heads, had become a rallying myth. He didn't ask for medals, he didn't even rest. He asked for coffee. Then he started designing new ships. The Velari observed orbital drydocks forming around Earth, Mars, and Ganymede. Factories once used for atmospheric harvest now assembled pulse cannons. Civilians volunteered en masse for zero-G construction. The caffeine industry tripled in size. Simulated war games began running continuously, 24 hours a day, designed by students with bloodshot eyes and dreams of vengeance. The Velari emissary attempted to communicate with one of Earth's diplomatic envoys, a woman named Admiral Rana Ibekwi. She met them aboard the UNSC Resolute, still wearing her engineering gear under the uniform. When the Velari asked what Earth intended to do in response to the Crucible incident, she smiled without warmth. "We're going to keep them up at night." The Velari found this metaphor disturbing. By the time the Thalkesh realized they had awakened a cultural shift, it was too late. Humanity had adopted insomnia as a virtue. There were no days off in the Terran strategic core. Sleep was monitored and rationed but never demanded. Research labs ran in staggered rotations where projects were passed hand-to-hand like relay torches. Earth's militaries became a 24-hour machine, and behind it all were minds like Mason's, minds that didn't just endure pressure. They thrived in it. Mason himself never returned to Earth. He stayed on Nightward, a repurposed asteroid mining station orbiting Tau Ceti E. There, he led a division unofficially known as the No Sleep Black. Its members were all veterans of the Crucible or trained under those who were. their motto hand-painted on the hangar bulkhead, "We dream with eyes open." Intel arrived in fragments. The Thalkesh were mobilizing, not an invasion, not yet, but something deeper. A purge campaign through the rim systems. Any world with human presence, any colony that might be aiding Earth was marked for erasure. Entire populations silenced in the name of containment. And one of those systems was luring via Terranolari Research Station. Mixed crew, civilian, defenseless. The operation to evacuate it became Mason's new obsession. He had 30 hours. He didn't sleep once. He hand-coded a jump vector that bent around solar interference. He retrofitted a mining tug into a mobile railgun platform. He repurposed an industrial AI core with a memory of Doom and StarCraft II as its tactical model. When the Thalkesh fleet arrived, they encountered more than human resistance. They encountered madness. A flotilla of junk rigs and repurposed freighters came at them with reckless patterns. They performed maneuvers no sane pilot would ever attempt because sanity wasn't part of the equation. Sleep-deprived genius was. Ships hurled themselves into firing lines only to slingshot debris fields into Thalkesh weapon arrays. The humans didn't fly like soldiers. They flew like insomniacs on the edge of inspiration. And it worked. The station was evacuated, minimal losses. The Thalkesh suffered their third major defeat. In the high chambers of Omthvara, panic bloomed like infection. Their models no longer functioned. Probability matrices failed to account for irrational initiative. They realized their mistake far too late. They had tried to break a species by denying it rest. Instead, they had unleashed what humans became when sleep was no longer an option. And deep in the void, Mason watched the stars. He was thinner now, hollow-eyed, but in those eyes burned a focus like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. "This isn't a war anymore," he murmured. "It's a group project." By the time the fourth year of open conflict began, the galaxy had split into two halves, those who feared humanity's rise and those who had begun to emulate it. The Thalkesh remained firm in doctrine. Their history stretched back millennia, empire forged by telepathic consensus, each generation tuned to emotional precision, hierarchy sculpted from psionic clarity. To them, war was an equation and order its solution. But Earth had injected a new variable. Humanity did not calculate its victories. It brute forced them. And leading the charge was a man who had not slept a full night in over 3 years. Mason Carter was no longer simply a legend. He had become the central mythos of a movement, an interstellar resistance not bound to Earth alone. Colonists, outliers, even alien species marginalized by the Thalkesh order began to flock to the banner of Project Wake. It wasn't a flag, it wasn't even a government. It was a network, decentralized, chaotic, and faster than anything the old powers could anticipate. Its philosophy was simple: when they try to break your will, show them your second wind. From his command node on Nox Ardent, a former Thalkesh observatory now jury-rigged into a stealth operations hub, Mason coordinated dozens of simultaneous actions. Not with formality, not with bureaucracy. With shared insomnia. Sleep cycles were no longer strategic assets, they were commodities. Hours of rest became bartered currency between cells. Combat engineers designed targeting algorithms during lucid dreams, then woke themselves screaming to upload the code. And as the strikes multiplied, Thalkesh control began to collapse at the edges. What unnerved them most wasn't the scope, it was the style. Human raids were loud, messy, improvised, the kind of madness that should have failed. But it didn't. Because no doctrine could predict what desperate minds would do at 3 a.m. on the verge of a nervous breakthrough. At the Battle of Drix Fold, a Thalkesh command ship was torn apart by a single Terran vessel using a maneuver no simulator had ever prepared for. An inverted temporal skip into the enemy formation, triggered by a pilot who hadn't slept in 6 days and was operating on a cocktail of cortical stimulants and unfiltered jazz. They named the maneuver the coffee spiral. It became standard curriculum. Back on Earth, the planet itself had shifted. Cities adapted to the new rhythm. Academic halls stayed lit around the clock. New engineering disciplines were founded on polyphasic focus management. Music changed, culture evolved. Humanity had not abandoned sleep. It had weaponized its absence. And yet, Mason Carter was beginning to fracture. He hid it well behind darkened visors, behind mission logs, behind jokes passed through static, but his body was deteriorating. Nerve conductivity was down. Muscle decay had begun. His heartbeat stuttered during high-acceleration maneuvers. He lived intravenously, fueled by artificial nutrients and the burn of purpose. But what no one knew, what he told no one, was that the hallucinations had returned. Not the dangerous kind. The inspiring kind. He saw equations where none existed. He heard voices speak in algorithmic pulses. His dreams, if they could be called that, were waking visions of engines yet unbuilt. And always, always the same phrase. You are not tired, you are becoming. He was evolving into something else. And the Thalkesh knew it. They saw his pattern no longer resembled that of a singular commander. It resembled a network pulse, a neural architecture. Mason Carter had stopped thinking like a man. He was thinking like a civilization. So they summoned an ancient weapon. Deep in the cradle of thought where pre-empire relics of the Thalkesh mindscape slumbered, they reactivated the Dream Blight. A psychic weapon capable of injecting horror into REM cycles, collapsing neural pathways through fear-born trauma. Once long ago, it had ended wars before they began. Species surrendered rather than risk exposure. Its return would not be announced. It would arrive silent, absolute, and inescapable. The Blight was deployed near Virx Theta, where a newly founded human-alien alliance was holding a summit. It spread without physical form, infecting minds through proximity, manifesting as shared nightmares among fleets, crews, whole stations. People began collapsing, not from wounds but from sleep. For the first time in years, the humans were forced to dream. And those dreams turned on them. Mason Carter felt it the instant it struck. He was aboard the mobile node Sleepless Flame, relaying codes for anti-blight neural firewalls when his vision ruptured. Not pain, not fire, but something colder, a whisper inside his skull. You are small, you are finite, you are unraveling. He hit the deck he seized, his crew tried to restrain him, and then he stopped moving. The Thalkesh rejoiced. Finally, the nightmare that they had created had ended itself. But on the 17th hour, Mason stood up. His vitals were wrong, pulse erratic, brainwaves peaking in frequencies not found in human neural charts. His voice when he spoke was hoarse and slow and terrible. I saw it. He wasn't talking to anyone, not really. I saw the end, saw the pattern underneath it all, not chaos, not fear, signal. It was trying to overwrite us, but we don't run on normal code. The officers aboard the Sleepless Flame stared as he pulled a neural injector from his skull, blood running down his neck. We don't dream to escape, he said, we dream to build. And then he broadcast something. A waveform, inaudible, unreadable, something translated through his own damaged neurons and fed directly into the pulsenet that powered Project Wake's interstellar lattice. Across 50 star systems, humans seized. Then they stood. The Dream Blight twisted in on itself. It tried to rewrite the minds it had infected, but found only locked doors, pulsing with the madness of creativity, fortified by hallucinated logic and caffeinated counter-narratives. Humans didn't fear nightmares. They used them. Within days, the Blight collapsed. It fed on fear. Humanity had already processed fear into function. What it encountered was not panic, but problem-solving, an endless, recursive storm of thoughts sharpened by exhaustion and fire. In Omthvara, the Thalkesh began to panic. The humans were no longer simply fighting back. They were changing. Mason Carter looked at the stars. No longer smiling, no longer coughing. I don't know what we are anymore, he whispered, but we're awake. And he wasn't alone. Across the galaxy, 1,000 more began to speak in his voice. The stars had stopped being silent. Where once the void was ruled by distant empires and ancient minds calcified in doctrine, now it buzzed with human transmissions, chaotic, layered, beautiful, not military commands, not official declarations. Music, laughter, equations, simulations, screaming arguments about reactor efficiency. Voices from 100 worlds carried on old analog signals and advanced quantum braid networks, stitched together by a species that had learned to function on the edge of collapse. The Thalkesh Empire was no longer simply under siege, it was infected. Their predictive models had fractured. The once stable equations that governed subjugation had been replaced by variables no theory could contain: spontaneous collaboration, irrational generosity, desperation-powered innovation. Every attempt to apply pressure produced not submission but surge. The harder they pushed, the faster humanity adapted. And behind it all, the same name echoed across every datasphere, across every defiant colony, across the nightmares of the Thalkesh High Synod. Mason Carter. He no longer commanded fleets in person. His body had finally begun to fail, eyes permanently bloodshot, spine riddled with microfractures, his blood replaced twice over to filter out a chemical brew of nootropics and stimulants. He did not sleep, he could not. But he could see. A neural lattice forged from brainwave imprints of every insomniac cell leader in Project Wake had been created on the captured moon station of Roanoke 12. They called it the Echolink. It allowed Mason to ride the consciousness of the movement itself, a mind scattered across billions, each thought echoing through him and amplifying his own. He had become something more than strategist, more than commander. He was the signal. An Earth, once a flicker of blue light in the dark, was now a pulse shaking the stars. The final Thalkesh stand came at the nexus of Veilrune, a convergent point of hyperspatial veins where three galaxies met in overlapping fold space. It was sacred to them, a cradle of thought where they had once designed the laws that governed their psionic empire. Humanity didn't know this. Humanity didn't care. They had identified it as a logistical bottleneck and sent 32 fleets toward it, most of them half-built, crewed by sleepless dropouts, rogue AIs, and scientist-turned captains who had memorized orbital physics instead of combat doctrine. The core of the fleet wasn't warships, it was problem-solvers with engines. They didn't wait for formation. They dove in screaming. The Thalkesh High Guard, once unshakable, now responded erratically, because the invaders didn't make sense. One ship broadcast a continuous loop of Mason Carter reading a dorm room manifesto on free will. Another used gravitational eddies to slingshot cargo containers filled with antimatter waste. One vessel rammed a command ship by detonating its own sleep pod coolant to breach a warp bubble defense. It was madness. It was genius. It was humanity. On the 6th hour of the battle, the Echolink surged with a new signal. Mason's voice. He had connected to every allied mind in the engagement. Not through words, but feeling, a rhythm, a pressure, a beat that every sleepless soul recognized. Not a command. A challenge. Let's finish the project. And so they did. The Thalkesh weren't defeated in a single blow. They weren't annihilated by overwhelming firepower. They were unmade, system by system, belief by belief, outmatched not by technology but by possibility. Because the humans didn't follow the rules of war. They rewrote them while fighting. By the 14th hour, the nexus of Veilrune was no longer a psionic monument. It was an open signal relay, flooded with human thought, a new lattice formed from shared neural imprints. Hundreds of species now connected through what had once been a tool of domination. And then the final miracle occurred. Mason Carter, his body barely functioning, was uploaded into the PulseNet permanently. His mind didn't die. It transcended. He became the permanent signal at the heart of the Echolink, a whisper at the edge of every dream, a voice that spoke to the sleepless, the mad, the inspired, not a god, not a ruler. A patron of those who could no longer sleep and chose to build anyway. The galaxy did not fall. It awakened. The Thalkesh Empire did not end in flames but in revelation. Some resisted, most did not, because deep down they had always known something was coming, something unbound by ancient order, not chaos, not anarchy. Impatience. The desire to move faster, to learn to fail, to dream while the eyes remained open. The post-war era was not called the Terran Age. It was called the Wake Epoch. And across the stars, on every world touched by human presence, a phrase emerged scrawled on stations, whispered during long nights of research, painted on the hulls of scrappy new ships. A warning. A promise. This is just college.